Join us on the next episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers as we delve into the classical education revolution, where it came from, where it's going, and what it might achieve with Eric Cook, President and CEO of the Society for Classical Learning. Let's go. Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers, a podcast on philanthropy and civil society. I'm Jeremy Beer, and it's great to have you with us. Recording today on October 1st, 2025, and this is the last pod we are recording this season, which has been dedicated to really innovative, pioneering nonprofit leaders who are doing something really important for American civil society. As we look forward to the semi-quincentennial next year. So excited to have with us today, Eric Cook. Eric is president and CEO of the Society for Classical Learning, which is dedicated to fostering human flourishing through the advancement of classical Christian education. Eric started his career as a history teacher in public school, became an administrator before he moved into classical Christian education in Roanoke, Virginia, back in 2007. And he and his wife live with their 6 children in Charlottesville, beautiful Charlottesville, Virginia. Eric, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you here. And it's great to be able to talk to you about classical education, which I think probably most people, if they're thinking about, want to make a list of things that seem to be kind of going right in America as we approach the semi-quincentennial. Like the classical revolution, as I often call it, the rise of classical education is going to be on that list for a lot of people. I think kind of just one of the great American success stories of the last of this century. Do you know how many kids are receiving a classical education today in America? How many schools there are? Do you have any sense what those numbers are?
Yeah, so Arcadia Education put out a report a year and a half ago. It's about 1,500 schools, about 1 million students now.
Yeah.
Well, then now that, if you include homeschoolers, that's the largest rising population of classical educators in the country. So,
yeah. So it's not insignificant. It's still a fairly, overall, what are there, 80 million students? I don't know how
60.
many. 60 million in the United
60,
States.
K-12.
Yeah, but where it used to be 1 in 1,000, now it's 1 in 60.
Right.
Students are getting a classical education. So let's just start there for people maybe who aren't as familiar. What is a classical education? Like, what are its hallmarks? And then maybe you can speak like when and what isn't a classical education?
Right. Well, first, I like to talk about classical education in terms of its ends. So John Adams said there are 2 types of education. One teaches you how to make a living, the other how to live. And that's really fundamentally what a classical education is about. It's about the formation of wisdom and virtue, forming a certain kind of person. And so that's fundamental to understanding before you start getting into the content or the methodology, to first understand the purpose.
Yes.
And that is a very different approach than modern progressive education and what's been the norm in the U.S. for some time now. So that's the starting point. So once you say that wisdom and virtue is the aim of education, then you do have to start talking about what are the means by which a person becomes wise and virtuous. And this is where you start getting into the greatest of what's been thought and said. And so classical education contains the great thinkers, the great texts, the great civilizations of Western civilization that we want to make accessible, and the great questions and the great conversation of Western civilization, of the best things that have been said, written, and conversed about, and put those in front of our children. So great books, classical languages, classical literature, questions of ultimate significance that are the ultimate why that students are thinking about and pondering throughout their education as they're formed into wise and virtuous young people themselves.
So we basically, we're really going back quite a ways in American history anyway. to retrieve something that looks like today's classical education. This isn't something that was the norm up to 1990. It wasn't
Right.
something that was the norm up till 1965 or 68, or to pick a revolutionary sort of year, right? Um, where did this revival come from? How did this? What are the roots of this new sort of classical education movement that's doing so well now?
Well, so the newest iteration in terms of the renewal, and by the way, the West is kind of this ongoing rebirth of these ideas. Spencer Clavin talks about this in How to Save the West, that there are always these sort of renewals that take place, the same ideas that emerge again and again. And that's in part because they're embedded in what it means to be a human being, to ask these questions, to think these important questions of ultimate significance, to retrieve the great ideas and make them accessible and apply to our own day. We need to be able to recover them. But this latest iteration happened in the early 80s, when there were a handful of classical schools that sort of popped up organically, but separately. There was Moscow, there was Logos Academy, there was Trinity Schools.
Moscow, meaning Moscow, Idaho, for people.
Correct. Right. And then there's a school out in Kansas that Cara Paravel. And so it's small, experimental, I would say, but it started to catch on from there, and people were experimenting and figuring out, what is this thing? How does it work? And slowly over time, there became a movement of schools that were attempting to do this and seeing the benefits and the beauty of it. And then by 2010, there were about 150 classical Christian schools and a growing number of classical non-Christian schools. And then around COVID time, it exploded. And the growth from there has been exponential.
And the growth seems always to be driven by the deterioration of the sort of mainstream model. So if you have in the 80s, you're experiencing then people who lived through the revolution of the late 60s, and I assume, right, that had to be kind of a reaction against that, and then that grows for a while, and then COVID sort of puts it into hyperdrive. Is that essentially the narrative?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think if you put alongside, the backdrop of the cultural issues, there's no question that was a motivator for a lot of Christian families in particular, who are trying to find a way to meaningfully form their children in ways that align with their values, and not seeing that available to them in any kind of public version.
Yeah. Although there are many classical charter schools, I guess we should make that clear too.
That's right.
There are public versions of this. It's obviously not Christian education, but it is a form of classical.
That's right.
Is that basically, from your vantage point, why classical has sort of blown up? I mean, how has this happened? What's sort of given the classical movement is this sort of energy and dynamism and market advantage?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors. Anytime you have a movement like this, there's a lot, I think, that goes into it, some of which are the obvious things, that just a renewed vision for what it means to educate our children, and asking some real fundamental questions about what works and what doesn't work. So that's more of the practical side of it. I think some of it in terms of demonstrating in the terms and the outcomes that your average parent cares about in the U.S. I think our schools have been able to say, we've exceeded those kind of SAT scores, college entrance, name something, but it's way bigger than that. And I think it's been a very compelling story to both aim at things that are true, good, and beautiful, and wise and virtuous, and parents who really resonate. That's what they ultimately want for their kids. Yeah. But they didn't really have that as part of their own story. Right. And so I think that is fundamentally what we all want as parents. So that's the easiest, answer. I think the incredible failure of the public school system as a backdrop, and then the sort of wave of cultural issues that have also made their way into our schools. A lot of the ideological stuff, the woke things, a lot of things that families have been concerned about, just their own safety, much less the academic rigor, where we have 2/3 of our kids who can't read at grade level. I mean, there's a lot of things that are sort of, factoring into this.
Yeah.
And so, you know, COVID only added to it because when parents were able to see, looking over the children's shoulders, the education that was being delivered to the children, there was a big motivator to say, we have to do something different. There has to be a better way. And I think that coincided with the rise of classical Christian schools and classical schools at large. And now those have converged and picked up lots of momentum.
As you point out, it's not terribly difficult to deduce why classical has emerged as an attractive alternative to your sort of average sort of public school education. But what's also happened, and this I'd really like to get your take on this too, is you've seen Christian schools of various kinds, Catholic as well as evangelical, various kinds of Reformed, all sorts of different Protestant schools shift from a non-classical to a classical curriculum. You've also seen that happen, right? And that's not been about the school sucks. It's been something that they've seen in the classical model that they think works better. I mean, what I'm sure you've seen that at SCL. I'm sure you see, oh, this school's switching over to classical. Why does that happen?
Well, I think for similar kinds of reasons. So if you think about, most schools have a portrait of a graduate. A portrait of a graduate is, if this school is doing everything that it can do and is accomplishing its mission, what kind of students do we want to leave here when they graduate? What is your character? What is it we want them to know, be able to do? But what kind of human beings do we want? And I think most of the aims that a parent ultimately wants would align with the aims and vision of a classical education. And they may not have the categories for it, but certainly that's the case among educators. And so returning and reviving something, I mean, the progressive model is really the outlier. I mean, for all of Western civilization until a very, very modern period, it was the way that people were educated in the West. So there's a renewal and a recovery. So it's not starting from scratch. It's really a renaissance, a renewal of things that have been latent there. And a lot of educators are rediscovering those things and finding them very compelling. And again, I will say, I think seeing the results of the kids who are coming out of our schools is very telling. And for example, here's something that happened when I was head of school in Fort Worth all the time. We would have kids who would go to Sunday school, and I would see one of the families, or I'd see the Sunday school teacher, and they would say, "What is going on at your school?" Because as they interacted with the teacher and in the class, and heard them articulate their ideas and talk about what they knew, they were excelling and standing out among their peers. And so there's been this kind of taking notice. And that's worked against us sometimes as well, because some classical schools have also been known for kind of wearing that, if you will, and not always being too humble about it.
A little bit of pride can enter into the situation, but that's and that's a tell, right? That's super distinctive. Well, we'll get to what's next for classical and some of the obstacles to continued growth and so forth here in a bit. But because I know that SCL has played a big role in this kind of thing, and this is your opportunity to kind of talk about what SCL does in particular. Talk about the infrastructure that has had to be created and still has to be created in order to provide sort of a matrix for classical education's growth. Because this doesn't just happen. Like all sorts of things, accreditation, teacher training, curricular development kind of has to be there for something to kind of achieve the scale that classical has at this point for it to continue to grow. So maybe you could talk about all that stuff behind the scenes that people never think about, and kind of how SCL plays a role in all that.
Yeah. So, as the movement has grown, there's an entire ecosystem that has developed around it. And that's been necessary because a lot of this, we've been figuring it out as we go. And so just trying to define it, for a long time, we had the hardest time just explaining to our families, for a lot of years, it was trust us, we know what we're doing, and try not to use too much jargon that'll confuse your parents. So messaging and marketing to our school communities. What is it? How do we explain it? How do we make it accessible and compelling to families who don't know anything about it? How do we define it clearly enough so that our pedagogy is clear, our curriculum choices are aligned with what it is we're trying to do and we say we're doing? And then how do we actually do it? Because we haven't even practiced it. So we don't have teachers who have been trained this way. So we've had to create a lot of systems and a lot of partnerships with colleges and universities and training programs and resources and books and publications and a whole infrastructure around this to train leaders and board members and really all that goes into making a school work. But to do it in a way that's aligned with the principles and the vision of a classical Christian model. Yeah. So that's taken some time to really sort out. So what we're committed to doing is ensuring that all the schools that are in our network have the resources that they need in order to become a thriving, sustainable, and that they're around for generations. So we developed an accreditation program a few years ago. So the first thing that does was to create an aspirational vision for what a thriving classical Christian school looks like. And we included many ed school scholars from all across the country to help us do this and to create a process for accreditation that didn't make a lot of the mistakes that common accrediting agencies do, which can come down to mindless, paper pushing bureaucracy that's meaningless in the end. We didn't want to do that.
Right.
So
to your credit.
We've created a system that I think is aligned with what school leaders need and want. That's aspirational. That then also helps them move towards a strategic vision for improving and actually providing the resources and support to help them do that. So that was a big step. There's a lot of leadership needs. We have way more schools than we do capable leaders, to fill those spots. Mm-hmm. So that's a constant challenge. So we do a lot of coaching, consulting, and working with boards and heads of school. And now we're also working to exponentially grow the number of classical Christian schools. Yeah.
Talk about that. That's what I was leading up to. I want to make sure we hit on this Generations Fund, which is a really exciting vision for maybe how this whole movement can be scaled significantly.
Yeah, so we had in our strategic plan, when I went full time in 2022, we started thinking about how do we grow this and make it more accessible to more and more people, because it's life changing, and we want more families to have access to it. And historically, that's been very difficult, and it's been only a thin margin of people who've been able to have access to this kind of transformative education. So we started thinking about that, praying about that. And we developed a relationship with Arcadia Education and Ben Lindquist and Eric Twist. And we were able to tap into their experience in growing charter schools. So we started thinking about, up to this point, the classical Christian school movement has been very organic. People started in churches, and a handful of families got together and decided we need to start a school. And but without a lot of collaboration or really proactive vision for people who've done it before, they're just, doing the next thing to try to figure out how to do it from scratch.
Right.
So what we wanted to do was try to find a way. Let's take the schools that have figured out how to do this really well and that have a proven model, that have dynamic leadership, that have a sound financial model, mature governance model. And let's help those schools find a way to replicate and be able to grow a whole network of schools just like them and plant 6, 8, 10, 12 schools in their region. And much like the Charter School Growth Fund has been able to do. So no one is actively trying to grow schools like this to scale.
Yeah.
And so we really wanted to lean into that and figure out a way to get that done. So we have started what we're calling a Generations Campaign, a $60 million project to grow more schools and invest in the replication of thriving classical Christian schools across the country. So we're in phase 1 now. We started that in February, which is 12 million, where you have very, very good success and support so far. But it's not only raising the money. We also have been meeting with schools, the school leaders all over the country, trying to cast a vision for this, because most of our school leaders now are running one site, and they're not even thinking about the possibility, because it's hard enough to run one school.
Of a multi-campus sort of system.
To run a multi-campus system is is not something that's on their radar. So we're trying to help them envision why they would want to do that and what the roadmap is to get that done. So it's really exciting.
And what are some of the advantages of that besides making classical education more accessible? There must be, economies of scale. You can share a back office. It must make it all just more economical, right? If to run 6 or 8, campuses rather than just one.
Yeah, there's economies of scale and economies of learning curve, because if you don't have to go figure all this out from scratch every single time you start a school and figure out what does governance mean, and we got to get some consultants. But if you have all those things established from the beginning, you're saving yourself an incredible amount of time and personnel and money, for that matter, to build something that is already proven that works. Then, in terms of economies of scale for the personnel and infrastructure, if you can get all of your back of house resources, centralized in things like HR and finance and marketing, you can really save yourself a lot of money, and you can get higher levels of talent.
I was going to say the same thing. Then you can afford to hire better people.
Right.
Yeah. And pay them what they're worth, and thus keep them and reduce turnover and so forth. So,
right. Exactly.
Yeah. And from a donor perspective, I mean, it's so attractive because you guys are going out there and finding the operators who are the most worthy of investment, who've showed the leadership qualities, or they've already figured this out. They have the dynamism, the vision, and so forth. I think it's always a challenge on the donor side not that single schools aren't worth investing in, they are. But boy, if you're investing in 10 schools, that's a different kind of return on your investment.
Well, that's exactly what we have found. I think, in education, it's been kind of a closed system, because if your default is that everybody just goes to your, local public school because that's what's available and accessible to you, and there's one, closed revenue stream, and those are public dollars that are funded through your public school. And for those who can afford it, go to private school, that's a market that's very constrained. Yep. But now that the school choice is now universal ESAs in some 17, 18 states, that changes things dramatically. Because now you have revolving revenue streams in states that can now go to wherever the parents want those dollars to go. And that unlocks our fund and leverages it exponentially. So the first school we're working with is in Florida, where every student has an $8,500 credit, and they can take that where they like. So if we have funding and we're investing in schools to grow, and every family brings per child $8,500, now we're really getting somewhere with that investment. It's been a good story to tell to our donors.
Hi, I'm Chris Kittemeyer, CEO of AmFell. I'm excited to share that this season of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers podcast is sponsored by AmFell. Whether your nonprofit needs help raising major gifts, building your donor pipeline, or crafting a winning fundraising message, AmFell has the expertise to help your organization thrive. We work with mission-driven organizations across the country to help them raise more money and advance their mission. Learn more at amphil.com. That's AMPHIL.com.
That the universal ESAs thing is game changing, which you said we're at 17 or 18 states. Now we also have a federal credit that will kick in a couple of years for a couple $1,000 per kid or something like that. That's on top of whatever the state provides, as long as you're in a state that opts in to the program. But still, so in many states, there's going to be something like $10,000 available per kid, if I'm understanding things correctly. This whole old idea that how long will it be, I guess, is the question before in those states. It's just not the normal thing to think anymore. Like local public school, that's where I send my kid. It's right away that people will be thinking as a matter of course, like I've got $10,000. I can send them wherever I want for that money, or I can choose a local public school. That neither one is necessarily like just the norm. How far away from that? How far away are we from that being kind of the reality, the psychological reality?
Well, one thing is that it does take time for these programs to get implemented. So, for example,
people don't know about them.
Exactly. I was going to say there's a gap between eligibility and participation. So even once you get one launched in the state, it takes time for families to kind of catch up and get involved. But for states that have been at this longer, like Florida, those participation rates are going up, and it's sort of dismantling the traditional system. So in the school I told you about that is in line for this Generations Fund investment, in the school district adjacent to them, they've lost some 20% of the students. And now they're having to figure out, how do we offer services that our families actually want, not just what we've always delivered. Yeah. And they're having to rethink their infrastructure, because when you lose 20%, that's food service, and that's curriculum, and that's facilities and busing and everything that financially is not going to work anymore. You're going to have to get a lot more creative and a lot more tailored to what parents are wanting, instead of what they can, control entirely.
There's a very funny Wall Street Journal headline about this. I think it was last week. It was something like, schools under competition from in the ESA states, public schools under competition from ESA states, reconsider model, thinking along, what did it say? Something like along the lines of a customer service model. I was like, oh, imagine that. They have to think in terms of serving their customers. What a shame that is. Now, there will be disruptions, actually. There will be some real sort of pain here and there. But ultimately, I think you could, where you have this robust competition, you think would help everyone be better. The other thing, though, in terms of the classical, one of the obstacles to participation is that there just aren't enough schools, aren't enough seats sometimes, right? And that's another thing you guys are trying to solve for. I mean, capital is the big thing. I don't think everybody understands. Like, public schools are built with taxpayer money. Taxpayers provide the capital. That's not the case with private schools. So that's a real obstacle.
Yes. So, when we were building, this financial model for the Generations Fund and thinking about capital allocation, and, most of your charter schools are even at a big disadvantage because they have limited facility allocation from the state, and they have to go generate that on their own. So the facilities is a big obstacle, as well. How do we find the places where these students can be housed without have to raise, 15, 20 million to build a campus or more? Mm-hmm. And so getting creative about how we generate that and then distribute it to schools, and then also how states now can distribute that to schools is going to be game changing. It's opened the market in really incredible ways. And you mentioned competition, but I mean, one thing that you haven't seen that's happening now, which to me is really exciting, is, in that closed system, you're not getting a lot of entrepreneurs, innovators. You're not even it's not attracting people who are very talented, who can respond to those parent needs and desires. Mm-hmm. Now you see people stepping into the space, eager to solve those problems and meet that demand. And not all of them will be good. And we've seen that in other states. That's fine. But those will be proven out, I think, over time. So now that there's a leveling, and we had Jeb Bush back in February, he came and spoke to our group of donors about this. But, he said just having an open market doesn't solve the problem. Universal ESAs alone doesn't solve the problem. Now we have to go build great schools so that our families can select them. Right. And they're not available. They can't be selected. That's what we want to do. Yeah. That's right. We want to solve that problem.
Yeah. And it will take some time. I think that's important that people understand that, it's not going to be like that. It takes time to get all these things in place. And that's what you guys are doing.
Well, there's real constraints. I mean, so if we have 6 million students right now who are in, Christian schools, and we wanted to get that to 12, I mean, you got to double the amount of teachers right now. Teachers is a big obstacle to scaling, growing the movement.
So there's 6 million Christian students. 6 million students in Christian schools right now.
Well, also in a Christian education setting. So some of those are
counting homeschoolers. So 10% or so of the total student population.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it's a great question. So if you want to get that to 20%, it's actually a massive mountain to climb.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's 300,000 teachers. So if you want to get to 600,000 teachers, right? I mean, that is not an easy thing to solve for.
And one of those constraints has to be rules that require teachers to have ed school training or certification somehow?
Well, so AEI put an article out called The Achilles Heel of Classical Education. And basically, they were analyzing this problem to say, if we ever hope to address the teacher pipeline issue, we have to get creative about shortening the distance between what it means to come into a classroom as a capable teacher.
Right.
And credentialing and some of these traditional programs, they're not very good, and they create significant obstacles to actually getting quality people in the classroom. So there's a bunch of ways we need to be able to solve for this. One of it is, we don't have enough even degree programs and certification programs.
Right.
Those aren't everything, but we do need formal instruction and formation of these teachers so that we can keep the supply going and fill it with the classrooms of really great people who know what they're doing and not playing catch up all the time like most of the movement has been up to this point.
And those are starting to come online, right? There are a few of these advanced degree classical education programs now.
That's right.
But there need to be more. What about the possibility of public school teachers coming over? So if you're in a state like Florida, which maybe, let's say you lose 5% of your public school kids or 10%, I mean, presumably you're going to lose, well, I shouldn't say in a teacher union environment, I don't know if you would lose jobs, but you might lose jobs. But maybe we know there's lots of great teachers who teach at public schools, and many of them are aligned with what classical schools are trying to do. Is there any possibility of that being a source of supply for qualified teachers?
Yeah, I think that's already happening.
Okay.
So what our schools are trying to do to respond is to build their own systems internally, because we know we're going to have gaps, and we're going to have to train people to be equipped to do this work. And so that means a lot of people who have worked in public school, who have a baseline, but they need to go deeper and they need to be kind of reoriented to be equipped to do it well. So that's why I was saying, yes, state level, yes, bring people over from industry, yes, build our own systems internally in the schools, and many other things. I think part of it, what's been interesting is if the vision for classical Christian education, which is what, we're doing SCL, has brought in a lot of really quality people. And I think, it's brought a sense of purpose into teaching that has kind of redeemed a lot of what education is being very bureaucratic, very detached, really focused on scores and outcomes. But to really put that formation at the center really puts the teacher at the center. And that's been compelling for a lot of people to come and want to teach in our schools. Yeah,
you become more than a box checker when you're teaching at a classical Christian school. You mentioned outcomes, scores and outcomes. We mentioned, are there how good a data do we have, or what data do we need, not only on sort of the score and educational attainment outcomes that we're seeing among kids who get a classical education, but I keep pushing this to people. I want somebody to show me some data, like attitudinal outcomes, behavioral outcomes, marriage rates, criminality rates, happiness, things like that. I have a sense of meaning and purpose in my life. Like that's what I want to see, because I feel like that would be where we see the biggest gap between classical school kids and alternatives.
Well, that's a good setup. We have a research project that we are.
I didn't even know it was a setup, so I'm glad.
We're neck deep into it. We will have something by next summer where we are surveying alumni and getting these kind of questions out in front of them. So there was one version of this done. It was called the Good Soil Report that ACCS did, I think, in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. And they did ask questions, ACT scores, SAT scores, did you finish in 4 years, 5 years, all that, did you get a degree?
Right.
But they asked another set of questions about, do you attend church every Sunday? Are you married? Have you stayed married? Do you have non-Christian friends? Do you, read books? I mean, all kinds of questions that would indicate, and positions on various, political and spiritual topics and so forth. So you are trying to get an assessment of how is this whole character been forced? Since that's the aim
Right.
of what we're doing,
Right.
how do we measure that without trying to reduce wisdom and virtue to metrics at the
To
same
numbers.
time? So
Yeah,
that's the
exactly.
that's the challenge. Yeah.
That is the challenge, but there are some markers, maybe substitute markers for wisdom and
Right.
virtue that we can at least, if we treat them
Right.
correctly. Well, that's great. I didn't know you guys are doing that, but I think that's fantastic because I don't think that's been done recently at all. And
Not
that's what,
recently.
and that's what many parents anyway. I wouldn't go so far as to say most, but many parents are interested in
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Another issue that I see come up a lot, that's not a lot, I see it start to come up now is question, kind of in an inside baseball kind of conversation is like, hey, should we even be talking about classical education at all? Like, is that a mistake in branding? You know, it scares people
Mhm.
off. It sounds super nerdy and alien and weird. What do you think about that? Is that an issue at all?
Yeah, well, I would say there's a group of classical educators across the country who meet a couple times a year.
The Illuminati of classical education.
We call it the National Council of Classical Educators. And we've talked about this a lot. And there are some within the ecosystem of the Institute of Catholic Liberal Education. They don't
Mhm.
want to use the term classical,
Mhm.
and they have historical roots that are really the argument for that they're trying to recover the Catholic liberal arts tradition. They don't want to confuse that with the term classical. That makes sense. That's fine. But it is hard. It's notoriously difficult to define in simple terms. And we've gotten ridden, many different ways about this. No one can explain what it is. And so that is a branding, because explaining is defending and marketing, and you don't want to get there.
Right.
But we also can't be overly reductionistic about, human formation. So, and it does represent, principally what we're trying to do and to recover. It represents a whole body of thought,
Right.
language, a tradition. And it does represent enduring ideas and principles. So it's been an ongoing conversation, but we're pretty deep into it to just change it at this point.
It's pretty tough for something called the Society for Classical Learning. I get that.
Right.
I just wonder, is it a real obstacle in the marketplace, I guess, is the question. To people putting their kids into classical school.
It's hard for me to measure that. So for some of our schools that are in urban areas, there's been some barriers, to overcome there, because there's certain perceptions about, what classical education is, kind of the old dead white guy, curriculum, and not understanding clearly what that means or what it implies. Even just this, critique of great texts and what represents the great text. And, there's been that whole debate as well. So it's fraught in some ways, but I think that's kind of a given too. I think you can call it whatever you want.
You're not in on great texts and great books. Like this isn't for you. I mean, that's fine. But yeah, I can see that it does. I know other people have voiced concerns that classical education will get coded or has been coded as right wing, as Republican, conservative, whatever. Is that a concern of yours? What would you say to that?
So I think we need to be really careful on this one. So it's kind of a loaded question for a couple of reasons. One, there are things that are inherent in classical education that are conservative in nature. So, for example, what it assumes about the human person. So, for example, if you're going to teach for wisdom and virtue, that assumes that wisdom and virtue exist, that we can discern what they are,
and that we should beautiful. It assumes that something is objectively true or good or
exactly
beautiful. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a whole host of other things, that there's a moral, objective reality, that we should conform our lives to it, that there's an order to society, that we should submit ourselves to things that are transcendent. That's a lot. Yeah. And that's not a shared assumption with a lot of people, right, in our culture. Now, those things I would say these are fundamentally human, things, and they shouldn't be relinquished. They're critical to the whole thing.
Right.
Now, that does not mean that every classical school, it needs to teach a right-wing platform. Here's what you need to believe about immigration and healthcare and
Tax policy.
welfare and tax policy and everything else. What we do need to teach is a deep roots of Western civilization, the primary texts, and the things and the ideas and the philosophies that have formed our nation, our culture, our freedoms, and then allow students to apply that in ways, to the current issues of the day.
Yeah.
And help them think through that well.
Yeah. Yeah. That's well put. It's very good. Is classical right for every kid? Or are there some percentage it's just not right for?
Also an ongoing debate within our...
I didn't mean to be throwing you. I didn't know these.
No, it's fine. Yeah, within our movement, in one sense, you could say that classical Christian education honors that everyone is made in the image of God and has these inherent human faculties that really the liberal arts are suited to cultivate. And but there are challenges with that, and a lot of them don't have anything to do with inherent cognitive abilities. For example, there's a lot of cultural things that make it challenging to deliver this. And I will say it's never been successful at being democratized on a very, very, very large scale, like we're trying to do now. Mortimer Adler tried to do this.
Yeah.
It's been challenging. But I think even if every child cannot have access to it, I think the principles do apply to every child. Everybody, can, and I would say should pursue a good life that's characterized by wisdom and virtue. That's good for everybody to the capacity that they're able to do that.
Yeah, that's right. That's well put. And it gives us a really good place to stop. Eric, I really enjoyed the conversation. How can people get involved with Society for Classical Learning?
Yeah, well, we would love to have anybody who's interested come visit our website, learn more about what we do. Anybody who's interested in investing in the advancement of classical education, we are full tilt in that project right now. So they can contact me through the website, and would love to talk to them.
Fantastic. Thanks, Eric Cook, President and CEO of the Society for Classical Learning, for joining us today. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, thank you.
Hey, thanks for joining us for today's podcast. If you enjoyed it, we invite you to subscribe or rate or review us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to our podcasts. Thanks a lot.